Welcome back. In this video, I'll talk about writing unit tests for Angular services and focus more on asynchronous methods. So let's get started. On this user service, we have one method called getUsers, and it returns an observable of users. And the model of user looks like this. We have 4 different attributes. And also, this method uses the get method from HTTP client. Basically, this line of code makes the HTTP GET API call to get the list of users. And also on the constructor, we are injecting HTTP client. So that also means we have exactly one dependency on the service. So based on this code, let's now write some unit tests. Before I jump into writing unit tests, one thing to note is that the main goal of unit testing is to test the object under test in isolation. So in this case, we are not going to test any behavior of HTTP client dependency, and we will solely focus on the behavior of this method, meaning we'll be testing the method of the service, which is getUsers. Let me start writing the code now. I'm going to give this the name of service, and let's try to add some test cases. I'll say getUsers should return the list of users. Now, the first thing we need is the instance of this service class, right? And that way we can get access to this method. So let me create an instance of this class. Before I create an instance of class, actually there are 2 different approaches to test your services in Angular. The first one is using testbed. Testbed is basically a collection of APIs that helps to write unit tests. And the second approach is to use the new keyword to create a new instance of the class. And I'm going to simply use the new keyword to create a new instance of user service class. User service type is user service equals new user service. We are getting some error here, and the reason for that is this class is expecting one dependency, which is HTTP client. So that also means we need to create an instance of HTTP class which can be injected on this class. Before I create a new instance of HTTP class, if we look on this line of code, line number 22, this line is making the real API call, right? And we don't want to have that while running unit test, because it doesn't make sense to make the real API call and hit the live database or some storage services to get the list of users. So we are going to create a mock version of this HTTP client, and also we are going to replace the get method with our own version. There are different approaches to create a mock of an object. The first one is, of course, we can create a brand new object, and then we can have all the properties and methods similar to the real object that we are going to test, or we can use SPY. SPY is the preferred approach for most of the developers, and I'm also going to use the same approach. In Jasmine, we can use SPY using jasmine.createSpyObject. And on the first parameter, we are going to give the name of the class we are going to spy on, which is HTTP client. And the second is the method that we want to test. In our case, we are going to mock get method, right? And the reason is that we don't want to make the API call, right? So I'm going to say get, but if you have other methods as well in the services, for example, you might have post, put, paths, and so on, you can have all those separated by comma in this array. Let me store this in a variable. I'm going to say mock client equals this, and then I can now pass this instance of HTTP client on the constructor. So we have our instance ready, Let me also try to give the type right here, Jasmine, and then spy object, followed by the name of the HTTP client. I'm getting some error here. It's because I need to import this one. So everything looks good. So let me try to write some tests now. First thing we want to test is get users. Whenever I trigger this get users method, my first expectation is that we need to call HTTP client.get method, right? And the second would be if the user subscribes to this user, they should be getting the list of users in a happy path scenario. So let me try to subscribe here, and when we subscribe, this should return observable of users. So I'm going to say users, type is user, and this user is already defined on this service, this interface. And let me try to print something here. We will be getting some errors based on this code, and I will be explaining about the errors shortly. As we can see some errors on the console here is saying cannot read properties of undefined. So this error is saying for some reason getUsers method is returning undefined, and therefore we cannot use this subscribe method. And the reason for this is when we create a new mock object using create spy object method, by default all the methods that we are spying on or replacing will return undefined. So in this case, get method will return undefined, and therefore we are getting this error right here. It's because if we are not returning anything on this line, then this method would also not return anything. If this method returns undefined, the main method will also returns undefined. So what we can do now is we can simply change that return value. In this case, we can do mock HTTP client get. We want to return some value on get call, and then we can say return value. As we saw earlier, it should return observable, right? Sorry, this line of code here, we are mocking get method. So on the get method, we are expecting observable. It's because get method returns an observable. So we need to use off keyword because off keyword returns an observable. We can check here and we can say it returns observable, and that's what exactly we need. And we need the list of users, which I already have on my another screen. I'm just going to copy and paste right here, and now I just need to copy this one and then paste over here. So with this change, our tests should be running properly. As we can see below, we can see the list of users, right, which is coming from this line of code. Now let's write some assertions. The first would be users.length to be 2, right? We know this. And the second assertion would be when we call this method, we are expecting to call get method from HTTP client with this argument. So we can say client.get to have been called. All our tests have passed. We can make it even better. We can just say once with. So we are saying we want to call get method only once with this URL. So let's say down the road, if one of your developers mistakenly made some changes on this URL, this kind of typo will be easily caught by unit test, right? And that's the whole purpose of writing unit test. Let me revert my code now. everything looks good. I want to share one more thing as well. There is a misconception that all the observables are asynchronous, but that is not true. Observable might be synchronous as well. In our case, this function returns a synchronous observable. To prove that statement, I'm going to add some log here. I'm going to add a log at the very beginning before we invoke this method, and then the next line would be probably here on the subscribe block. I'll say subscribe inside, and the other would be after adjacents, right? We have two adjacents here. We can say subscribe end, and finally we can add one more log at the very end of the test. I'll say end of test. Let me save this file. If we look on our terminal, we can see start, and then after that we have subscribe inside. After that we have subscribe end, and finally we have end of test. And we can see that the order of logs are exactly similar to how we have written our code right here. This proves that the observable that's written by this user is synchronous. Let me try to mimic a scenario of asynchronous observable. We can do that by adding some delay on our observable using delay. Delay can be found on RxJS library. Let's try to put a delay of 4 seconds or 4000 milliseconds. After I save this file, let's see what happens on our log. We can see that we have start, and then we didn't see anything inside the subscription. We saw end of test, right? And then we also saw this warning saying this line of code or our test doesn't have any expectations because the test runner never got onto this block of code. So to fix this problem, there are two different approaches. The first one is to use done. Done is basically a kind of marker that helps the developer to decide when the test has successfully ended. So in my case, I know that if the code reaches to this line, our test has successfully completed. So here I can mark using done method. So this basically means we are done with our test, right? So now let me save this file. So we can see start, end of test, there's some delay, and after the delay we saw subscribe inside, and after this we have subscribe end, right? So everything is logged now, but the order is different, right? We have start and then end, and after 4 seconds it got onto this block, it printed these logs, and then our test is completed. And also if you notice carefully, the total time it took to complete this test is 4 seconds and 29 milliseconds. This 4 seconds is because of this delay. So now you might be thinking, what if I have, let's say 20 or 30 unit tests which are using delay or some kind of timeouts? In that case, the total time to run your unit test will be longer. So there's another approach which helps to solve this problem. Let me first undo my changes here. The second approach is called fake async. So this is basically a function which wraps our test function, and it helps to write our test synchronously, even though we have some asynchronous code right here. And I think this is very powerful. And also inside this fake async function, there are a few functions that we can use to write our test synchronously. As you can see that when I save this file, we are getting some error. So what this error means is there's still some timing thing going on here, right? And this is complaining about this line of code, right? And also on the test, we can only see two logs, start and end. We didn't see any log inside the subscribe method. So there is this method called tick. So the whole idea of tick is about advancing the clock or fast forwarding the clock. So in our case, if we want to complete the time of 4 seconds, we can set tick and then we can pass exactly 4 seconds. When I call this method, this delay will be completed, right? We are advancing our clock and then it will go inside this line of code. If we look on our log, we can now see start, right? And then we can see subscribe inside. After that, we get subscribe end and then finally the end of test. And also, as mentioned earlier, even though our code is asynchronous, we are writing our test synchronously, which can be proved with the log order right here. And also, the total time it took to complete the test is this right here, which is less than 4 seconds and something that we saw earlier. Now, let me try to add one more line of code on user service. Let's imagine after we get some data from this get call, we want to process something, right? I'm just trying to simulate that scenario. So let me add some delay here as well. So in this scenario, our test will fail. And the reason for that is we already have delay of 4 seconds on this method, right? And after we get response from get method, we are again adding delay of 3 seconds. So the total delay is 4 seconds plus 3 seconds, which is 7 seconds, right? But in our test, we only have timeout of 4 seconds, right? We are only fast forwarding the clock by 4 seconds. So there's still 3 seconds remaining, right? So we can again fast forward that time with 3 seconds. And then if I save the code, then everything will work as expected. Or if you want to have just one line of code, you can just do 7 seconds. That's it. Now let's try to focus on the service methods returning promises. So what we are going to do now is I'm going to replace this method, which is currently returning an observable of users, to promise of users. So the only change I made is that this function now returns promise instead of observable. And also, we don't have any dependency on the constructor. It's because we are using the fetch method from window object. We can do window.fetch or simply we can do fetch. And then this line of code is again doing the same thing. It's making get API call and then getting the list of users. If you look closely here, this method returns promise of response. If we look on the response, this extends body. And then when we look on the body, it has a bunch of methods and one of them is JSON. And this JSON function returns promise. So if we look here, we first get the response and then when we execute the JSON method, it returns promise. So this is how fetch method works. So now based on these changes, let's fix our unit test now. So the first thing we need to do is we don't require this dependency anymore because we are using fetch from window object directly. We don't need to have this mock object here as well. And on the user service, we no longer require the dependency as well. And the other change is the subscribe, right? So for promise, we have to use then. We need to use subscribe only for observables. And this get users will now return promise of users. We don't need to make this assertion, but instead we will make a new assertion which will say basically the fetch method from window object has been called with this URL. But for the timing, let me just comment this code out. And also we don't require the tick method and also we don't require this fake async. So now let me save this page and check on the console. If we notice here, we got the start log and then we got the end of test, which is right here. And then it's saying our test doesn't have any expectations. And if you notice here, we have this log which is subscribe inside, but we never got the log of subscribe end. And if you look closely here, we are getting this error which says unhandled promise rejection. So now how can we fix this? So before jumping onto fixing this problem, we need to understand the root cause of this problem. Our test runner, which is Karma, is expecting the test to be synchronous, which is not the case anymore because of the use of promise. When our code reaches here, it assumes that our test is completed, but in reality, that's not the case. So the first approach to solve this problem is to use the done method that we used earlier. So I'm going to use the same done method here. And then we know when we reach this line of code, we are done with our test. Let me save the file. So now we saw this start log, and then we saw the end, and then after that we saw subscribe inside, right? And the reason for this is because of asynchronous operation, right? And then we saw the subscribe end, which is good. And then we saw this issue, right? It's saying expected 200 to be 2. And the reason for this is our test is actually hitting the live API URL. And we can prove that when we console these users right here. If I save this file, we should be seeing a lot of users. It's a big array which has a bunch of users. So as mentioned earlier, it's not a good idea to hit the live API URL while running the unit test. So we need to mock the actual fetch method with our own implementation. Let me try to mock this method quickly. So before we invoke this method, we need to mock that. So I can mock right here, that's not a problem. So to mock that one, we can use this method called spy on, and then we want to spy on the window object, and we want to replace the actual real fetch method with our own implementation. And then we can do and return value, right? So what should be the return value of fetch method? So if we look here, fetch method should return a promise, right? Promise of response. And then after that, we need to trigger this JSON method, which returns again a promise. So we need to create a mock object or stub to simulate this scenario. I'm going to create a new stub here. I'll say fetch stub, and then I'll just do any for the timing here because we don't want to mock everything. We just want to mock that's needed in our test. And then it will be, and so this would return a promise, right? So this should, I'll say new promise, and then promise has two methods, resolve and reject, but we are just going to simulate the resolve scenario. And I'm going to add the result right here, and this should resolve the response, right? So let me create the response. So let me do resolve, and then I'll do response stub, which we are going to create now. Stub, and this response should have this method, right, which is JSON. So let me create JSON method, and then this method should return promise again, right? So let me try to now return a new promise. Here I'm going to add res, since we already have used resolve on the upper promise. So I'm going to say just res, and then here we need to resolve the actual data, right? In this case, this will return the list of users. So in our case, this resolve will resolve the list of users. So now we can just pass this stub, right here, right? So once again, we are just trying to simulate this scenario in order to prevent from making the actual API call. If I save this file, and then we saw the start and then we saw the end of test, but for some reason we are getting some issue here. Let's try to debug this code now. So this code looks good, and then before we actually call this method, we just spy on this method and then call this return value. Let's take this stop quickly here. So we are returning a promise, and then inside promise we are creating a stub. We have session, we have new promise. Oh, sorry, so I guess we have to use res, not result, right? That's the problem. So let's try to res, because this result is from the inner promise, not from the outer promise, right? So now if I save the page one more time, so now we can see only 2 users, right? So this also proves that we have successfully mocked the fetch method, because earlier we were getting the actual user by hitting the real API, which is not the case anymore. So now everything looks good so far. We have mocked our API, all of our adjacents are passing as expected. The second approach is to use the fake async method that we used earlier as well. So I'm going to undo this line of code, and we don't need this anymore as well. I'm going to wrap our function with fake async like we did in case of observable. Let me close the wrapper function, and then after we wrap our function with fake async function, the last thing we need to do is call this function called flush microtask. And the reason for this is we first need to understand how event loop works in JavaScript. So basically, promises are part of microtask, whereas setTimeout and other normal operations are part of macrotask. And they have different priorities because they are from different queues. When we call this one, it will basically resolve promise, right? So in our case, it will resolve the promise, and then everything will work synchronously like we saw earlier. So let me save this file. And if we look here, we have start, and then we get the list of users. We have subscribe inside, and that's it. Or we can also use plus here. This will also work. It's because plus will basically first try to clear the micro task, and also it will try to flush other macro operation. So this will basically clear micro task. So in our case, promise is part of micro task, and flush is basically doing this one. Plus it will also advance the timer, that tick thing, and also clear macro task, right? So it's doing a lot of things. You can only simply use flush micro task because we don't have any timeouts and delay in our case, or you can call flush as well, right? Both will work. Let's check this as well, right? Or you can even call tick, because tick will also do these two things, right? So this will also work. So now let's try to add some complexity in our code. Let's try to add some delay in our promise. I'm going to add some setTimeout, and then I'm going to put the result inside this setTimeout callback function. I'm going to add some delay of, let's say, 3 seconds. So now if I remove this line of code, right, let's say it's failing first, right, we can see that we still have one timer still in queue. It's similar kind of error message that we saw earlier. To fix this, if we only use flush microtask, will this work? No, it's because this function is only resolving promises, But in our case, in addition to resolve the promise, we also need to fast forward the timer. And this function is not going to do that. Let's first save the page and see the result. So this is still complaining, but if I use plus, this will work, right? Everything is passing. And if you notice, again, everything is synchronous, even though our code is asynchronous. And this is possible with the help of fake async zone, right? And then if I try to use the tick method, will this work? No, it's because by default, tick method will use 0 millisecond, but the total time that we require is 3 seconds, right? So let me add 3 seconds. Now our test should pass, right? Because we have completed this timeout, and also this tick will flush the microtags where our promises are stored. And let me add one more timeout. Let's imagine we have one more timeout. Let's say here, right? I'm going to copy this line of code. Let me try to add 4 seconds. Will our code work? No, because there's still timer in the queue. So what we can do actually is we can add one more timer right here, which is 4 seconds, right? So now everything will pass. Or if you don't like to use tick, you can simply call flush. This will advance our clock accordingly here for both timeouts and also resolve the promise, which is part of microtask queue. If I save this one, everything looks good. So this is how we test service methods returning promises, and also we try to include setTimeout to simulate some delay on our promise, and we saw the use of fake async, tick, flush, and flush microtask functions. That's pretty much it for this video. I hope this video helps. If you like my videos, please share and subscribe to my channel. It will help a lot to grow my channel. Thank you very much. Until then, see you on the next video. Bye bye.